Psychopath. No startle reflex. The startle reflex, also known as the acoustic startle response, or Moro reflex in infants, is a primitive, involuntary physiological reaction to sudden, unexpected stimuli such as loud noises, abrupt tactile sensations, or visual threats. This reflex manifests as a rapid sequence of motor and autonomic responses, including eye blinking, neck flexion, shoulder shrugging, arm abduction, and knee bending, often accompanied by increased heart rate, blood pressure, and skin conductance. Scientifically, it serves as a protective mechanism deeply rooted in human evolution and neurobiology, enabling quick defensive actions against potential dangers. From an evolutionary perspective, the startle reflex likely originated in ancestral vertebrates as a survival adaptation. In prehistoric environments, where predators and environmental hazards were omnipresent, a delayed response to sudden threats could be fatal. The reflex bypasses higher cortical processing, allowing for sub-second reaction times, typically 50 to 150 milliseconds from stimulus onset to muscle contraction. This rapidity is evidenced in comparative biology. Similar reflexes exist in mammals, birds, and fish, suggesting conservation through natural selection. For humans, it provided an edge in evading attacks or falls, enhancing reproductive success. Studies in evolutionary psychology link it to preparedness for fear, where innate responses to relevant stimuli, for instance, sudden sounds mimicking predator approaches, are hardwired, reducing the need for learned behaviors in high-stakes scenarios. Neurologically, the startle reflex is mediated by a subcortical pathway centered in the brain stem. The primary circuit relays signals to the nucleus reticularis pontis caudalis, the NRPC, in the pons. From there, excitatory projections activate motor neurons, triggering bilateral muscle contractions. This pathway is modulated by the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, integrating emotional context. For instance, fear-potentiated startle amplifies the response in threatening situations. The reflex also engages the sympathetic nervous system, releasing certain stimuli, preparing the body for fight or flight by increasing arousal and redirecting blood flow to muscles. Physiologically, the startle serves multiple protective functions. The eye blink shields the cornea from debris or impact, while limb flexion creates a defensive posture, mimicking exposure of vital areas. In infants, the reflex elicited by sudden support loss includes arm extension and grasping, potentially aiding in clinging to caregivers during falls. Research shows that the startle magnitude correlates with stimulus intensity, where perceived intensity is logarithmic to physical magnitude. However, the reflex's utility extends beyond immediate defense. It facilitates attention reorientation, interrupting ongoing activities to assess threats. Dysfunctions highlight its importance. Exaggerated startle in post-traumatic stress disorder reflects amygdala hyperactivity, while diminished responses in schizophrenia indicate reticular formation deficits. In modern context, while threats are less primal, the reflex persists as an anachronism, occasionally maladaptive, for instance in anxiety disorders. Yet its conservation underscores evolutionary inertia. Traits that conferred ancestral advantages endure unless selectively disadvantageous. In effect, what you learned from your ancestors all of those thousands of years ago has endured, although it's not necessarily as necessary as it once was. It's a rapid automatic defense response to abrupt sensory stimulation. Its biological role is to protect the organism from a sudden attack or injury. In humans, one of the most pronounced components of the startle reflex is the eye blink that can be elicited by strong, abrupt sound and quantified using the measurement of electromyographic activity of the muscle responsible for the eye blink. Thus, most people have a startle reflex, which is an evolved response to external stimuli and is used to protect you and defend you. For some people, it can be exaggerated. I don't have one. For some people, it's blunted or is absent. For me, it's absent, which means that when there's a loud bang or somebody jumps out at me, I don't blink, I don't shrink back, I don't raise my hands in defense. I don't get jumpy as a consequence of that behavior. I don't suddenly go, ah, when somebody jumps out at me, because I don't have this startle reflex. Now, in some instances, I'm sure that you would imagine that could be a problem, because after all, it's meant to be a defense measure. It's meant to be there to protect me. And if I'm not startled, presumably that then opens me up to some form of attack. Well, that is certainly one view. But as a consequence of my other attributes, the training that I've received and my psychopathy, it actually provides me with a distinct advantage in relation to dealing with certain situations. Naturally, if somebody just jumps out at me to try and scare me and I don't react, they're not actually intending to harm me. In fact, it means that they are rather surprised by the fact that I didn't react, and actually serves to my advantage. In many instances, the response to a loud noise by not reacting to it doesn't confer any disadvantage. In more threatening situations, the fact is that rather than be startled, my response, as a consequence of the way that I am wired and also my training, is such that I respond to the threat in a more nullifying way as opposed to defensively. I am more reactive in the sense of asserting rather than shrinking, of responding with controlled aggression rather than a defensive mechanism. And I talk, or rather write more, about the absence of my startle reflex, how I came to understand that it was missing, and explaining various instances of its application in my forthcoming book, The Psychopath, which will be available in a few weeks' time, and tells you a lot more about my psychopathy and how it functions personally to me, how I see the world, how it operates, allowing you to understand much more about the topic of itself, but in particular in relation to how it operates for me. A really good read, and make sure you look out for that. Accordingly, the absence of my startle reflex is linked to my psychopathy. But why is that? Well, it's been suggested to operate as a psychophysiological marker of psychopathic personality, based upon findings from a range of studies. Results indicate that reduced aversive startle potentiation, as it's called, is associated with psychopathic personality in general, but clusters of traits relating to boldness and meanness in particular. Accordingly, the prevalence of boldness and meanness result in the reduced or absent startle potentiation. Available evidence suggests that the startle reflex could be meaningful for differentiating individuals with and without psychopathic personality. Remember, psychopathic personality is multifaceted rather than it being a unitary construct, that there are degrees of the traits rather than just having it or not having it. Now, you'll recall that the suggestion many years ago was that psychopathy arises from an underlying emotional deficit, which involves impaired reactivity to negative emotional stimuli. Research has demonstrated that absent or reduced aversive startle potentiation exists in individuals with psychopathic personality, which has been interpreted as evidence that psychopathy involves a lack of fear. Psychopathic personality has traditionally been conceptualized and measured as a unitary condition marked by antisocial deviance and tendencies towards severe criminality. The emphasis on the antisocial behavioral features may partially result from the presence of such traits in individuals who otherwise appear to be rational and high-functioning. Two main conceptualizations of psychopathy have dominated historical perspectives thus far. The first centered around the concept of masked sanity, which Cleckley had written about, and the second related to a more aggressive and cold criminal offender who engages in severe and persistent antisocial behaviour and is resistant to treatment. McCord and McCord wrote about that in the 60s. These alternative conceptualizations of psychopathy have resulted in a diverse body of work that has exerted strong influence on the study of psychopathic personality over the years. Now, it used to be the case that most of the studies on psychopathy focused predominantly on incarcerated examples, but more recent work has been in studying and assessing psychopathic traits and behaviours in the general population, with the greater understanding that actually psychopaths are going to be found more in the general population than they are necessarily in an incarcerated one. There have been important developments in the use of self-report measures to assess psychopathic personality in the general population. The bulk of the evidence suggests that psychopathic personality is dimensional and not categorical, meaning that it can vary to a certain degree between individuals rather than being present or absent. Boldness connects to the description of primary psychopathy and reflects the ability to remain calm in threatening, novel, or otherwise stressful situations, along with social efficacy, dominance, and an absence of anxiety. Individuals high in boldness exhibit reduced autonomic activation and the absence of defensive reflex priming when exposed to threat cues. In other words, we don't respond in a traditional way to the appearance of things that are a threat and that would cause fear. We perform well in relation to cognitive tasks under conditions of unpredictable threat. For instance, I've mentioned before in respect of the ability of Neil Armstrong, the astronaut, to land the lunar spaceship under pressure when they were running out of fuel and had problems in relation to finding a landing site. Meanness is akin to the callous, unemotional aspects of psychopathic personality and entails deficient empathy, exploitativeness, and aggressive manipulation of others. The third aspect is disinhibition, which encompasses low impulse control, impaired regulation of affect, and an overall proneness to externalizing problems, and is thought to reflect deficits in the frontal regulatory circuitry of the brain. Individuals high in disinhibition are motivated by external rather than internal goals. I've spoken about how I will provide you with information about the differing categorizations of psychopaths, linked, of course, to the level of boldness, meanness, and disinhibition that are exhibited. As I explained, the startle reflex is an involuntary primitive response to a sudden or threatening stimulus that is associated with defensive mobilization, experienced internally as unpleasant activation or fear. It serves a protective function in coping with potential threats by interrupting ongoing action and directing attention to the source of threat. The startle reflex, as I mentioned earlier, affects the whole body, but the first and fastest element is the eye contraction. Typically, the startle blink response is enhanced when the subject is presented with unpleasant stimuli compared to neutral stimuli, and decreased when presented with pleasurable stimuli. The fact is that in relation to this, studies have demonstrated that the psychopath linked to boldness either has a reduced or absent startle reflex. And it's as a consequence of a differing physiological response appertaining to the way that the brain is formed and the activation of the nervous system. The purpose that it serves allows, for instance, an alternative response to that of being defensive, which of course fits with boldness. Rather than being on the back foot as a consequence of being startled, the removal of it allows the predatory psychopath to respond in an alternative manner, which is linked, of course, to the pursuit of the necessary triad. By not shrinking back, by not jumping, by not blinking and then being ready to run, the psychopath is in a better position to assert control, which is one of the parts of the necessary triad. It also means that attention is directed towards being stimulated by the event rather than being fearful and retreating from it. Stimulation also being an aspect of the necessary triad. Thirdly, by remaining in situ and addressing the situation rather than shrinking back and being defensive or indeed retreating, this creates a better opportunity for accumulation. Naturally, the absence of this startle reflex provides various opportunities for the psychopath to engage in certain situations that those affected by it would be less effective. But overall, what it does is, as a consequence of the different makeup of the psychopath with a blunted or absent startle reflex, it means that the necessary triad is easier to obtain. In the way that the narcissist is designed more effectively through the sense of entitlement, the absence of emotional empathy, the lack of accountability, etc., so that they can pursue the prime aims. The absence of the startle reflex in the psychopath is a necessary aspect linked to the pursuit of the necessary triad. It means that the psychopath is going to be far more effective at gaining that necessary triad. It's a little bit like, as I've explained previously, that a shark is designed to live in water, to hunt in the water, not on land. You aren't designed to live in the water. Similarly, the psychopath has been designed, through evolution, for the pursuit of the necessary triad, and the absence of the startle reflex is part of the necessary makeup of the psychopath to ensure that that necessary triad is obtained, and obtained frequently and effectively. For if we had the startle reflex, it would interfere in the pursuit of the necessary triad and make us less effective. As mentioned in my book, The Psychopath, I'm going to be telling you more about the absence of this startle reflex and various instances of where it has served a useful purpose for me. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.